So welcome, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Mary Ellen Fullerton, and I'm the Dean of Brooklyn Law School for this year. And one of my great pleasures is to be able to introduce you to the panel tonight and to welcome you to Brooklyn Law School. For our second annual Brooklyn Lecture on International Business Law, we are delighted to have Professor Dani Rodrik talking about globalization's wrong turn. As most of you know, he is the Ford Foundation Professor of International Political Economy at the Kennedy School at Harvard. He's a world-renowned economist and a leading critic of globalization. You read about him all the time in the news, and he's done so many things. I won't take our time tonight to list them all, but I do want to draw your attention to two highlights. His recent book, Straight Talk on Trade, which came out in 2017, and before that, his brilliant and, I must say, also accessible book, The Globalization Paradox. If you haven't read them, I know some of you have them with you tonight. Good for you. But if you don't have them, please get them. You're in for a treat. We're thrilled to have him here. We're thrilled to have this topic addressed and discussed and criticized and looked at from all sorts of angles right here tonight. After Professor Rodrik gives his opening lecture, we're going to have an interdisciplinary roundtable. And this is also an intra-neighborhood roundtable. We have some of our very own professors from Brooklyn Law School, Professor Robin Efron, who's sitting to my right, and to my left, Professor Julian Arado, who are the co-directors of the Block Center, and who I do have to pause for just a moment to give a special plug for all the work they've done for the Block Center for International Business Law Studies here at Brooklyn Law School, and for putting this program on. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Next to Robin is Professor Stephen Dean, who we are claiming, even though he's currently working at NYU, and you can see on the table setting, he's the fulcrum here. He's between the Brooklyn Law School side and the NYU side, and we're not letting NYU claim him. We look forward very much to Steve's comments tonight. And then beyond Steve, we've got Ben Heath from the lawyering program at NYU. We've got then Thomas Streintz from the Institute for International Law and Justice at NYU. And at the far end of the table, we've got Professor Sanjay Reddy, who's coming to us from the New School for Social Research. And we're so glad to have not only interdisciplinary perspectives from different academic disciplines, but interdisciplinary from different neighborhoods and different institutions here in New York City. Before I turn you over to the program, I want to give a special acknowledgement to our events staff who set up this program tonight and who always do wonderful work for us and work behind the scenes to make things happen in ways that we sometimes don't even understand, but we certainly do want to thank. And the Brooklyn Journal for International Law, which is a co-sponsor of the event tonight with the Block Center. Thank you to all the Block Center fellows who are here. And without further ado, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Professor Julian Arado. Thanks again, though, particularly to Professor Dani Rodrik and to all our panelists. So if you join me in giving them a hand before they start.
All right, well, you're not here to hear from me, you're here to hear from Professor Rodrik. So I just want to say on behalf of the Block Center, thank you so much for joining us, and I'm sure we'll have a lot of chances to exchange after you speak. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Professor Dani Rodrik.
Thank you, Julian. Thank you, Mary Ellen. It's really very nice to be here. I'm especially privileged to have this wonderful panel of lawyers and single economists to keep me company here. The two of us are, I guess, pretty unrepresentative as economics goes, but we'll try to hold the economics part of the debate. I'm often viewed as a critic of economics, but when I end up in sort of interdisciplinary groups, I end up defending economics. So we'll see how this goes. In any case, I'm really looking forward to the discussion that will follow my presentation. In fact, I'm tempted to just skip through my presentation very quickly, just so that we can actually get to that exchange. But let me see how quickly I can do that. I guess the first point that I want to start out with is to get us out of the habit of thinking of globalization as a kind of a single thing that you can measure on a spectrum, and there is either more globalization, less globalization. You're either in favor of globalization or against globalization, and the only choices are to move forward in globalization or to stop it. Now, I have to say that for this kind of audiences, might be sort of fairly evident that the devil is in the details, and the lawyers know the details that economists typically don't know. But it's still useful, perhaps, to sketch out very broadly what I mean by that in terms of the history of at least three kinds of globalizations that we have had. And this is a very schematic representation of how these three different types of globalization differed. So going from the bottom up, we have our most recent period. I don't have a very good name for it. Sometimes I sort of call it the hyper-globalization period, and maybe that's I'll call it this evening. But sort of the post-1990 period of globalization, then the Bretton Woods regime, the 3.5 or 4 decades after the Second World War, which I want to insist was a different type of globalization, and the wrong turn that I'm going to be talking about is really the switch from the Bretton Woods to the hyper-globalization model. But it's also useful to have, going all the way back in history, the first era of globalization, the gold standard. And that's useful because in many ways, although the details differed, in many ways, the post-1990 globalization model was a return back to the spirit of the gold standard. Although, as this makes clear, the details are very different. So looking here, I have sort of 5 columns, sort of aspirational columns in terms of what these regimes try to do, in terms of just exchange of goods and trade and investment and labor. You can distinguish between sort of whether there was free trade in goods, free trade in capital, and free trade in labor services. And of course, really the gold standard was the only one that had all three. The Bretton Woods regime really aspired to really free trade in goods, but certainly capital mobility was outside the rules, and no aspiration for labor mobility. Post-1990 globalization, has kept labor mobility off the agenda, but capital mobility or financial globalization has definitely become part of this model of globalization. If we look at sort of 2 other aspects, one, the fourth column here, which I think is particularly important, and I think that's the sense in which I think the hyperglobalization, the post-1990 hyperglobalization is very similar, as I said, in spirit to the gold standard, is the question of whether actually the rules reached beyond the borders. That is, do the rules significantly constrain what you can do domestically in terms of your ability to manage your economy, in terms of your regulatory structure, your taxation, the conduct of your macroeconomic policies? And in the gold standard, it was very clear that in terms of your macroeconomic management, the terms of what you could do were set by what the gold standard required. The fact that you had a fixed parity to gold, and that you had to maintain an open capital account and free mobility of capital of all sorts, and that the fact that you always had to pay your debts back no matter what, essentially defined a regime where what you could do behind the border was actually significantly restrained, and I'll come back to that. And interestingly, of course, as the 5th column indicates, these rules were actually not enforced through some multilateral institutions. In the post-war period, we think about the GATT, later the WTO, the IMF. There was nothing like that under the gold standard. Instead, the rules were enforced in the case of the metropolitan countries by very strong domestic norms about what you were allowed to do and what you were not allowed to do. And I'll talk a little bit about the internal sort of rebellion against those norms, which typically took the form of some kind of populism. And in the case of the peripheral countries, those norms were essentially enforced by, in the limit by gunboats from the center countries. If you didn't pay your debts back, it was the gunboats would show up at your doorstep. I mentioned that when the rules reached behind the borders and the rules were perceived as antithetical to what large segments of the domestic polity required, then you typically got this reaction. And in fact, historically, the very first self-consciously populist movement, of course, was the U.S. Populist movement that arose out of the grievances of farmers after the 1870s in the United States, farmers in the southern and western parts of the country. And what were their grievances? Well, the grievances were fundamentally economic, that they were being squeezed by influences from the world economy. On the one hand, a period of price deflation, that is, that commodity prices and the prices of goods that we're producing were going down. On the other hand, nominal interest rates remained relatively high, so this very real interest rate burden that farmers faced. And what was the remedy? The remedy, of course, was what today we would call essentially, policies of reflation or policies of easier credit. Under the rules of the gold standard, you couldn't do that because your money stock was essentially tied thanks to the fixed parity, and therefore we get this famous cri de coeur from William Jennings Bryan, running as the Democrats' presidential candidate in 1896, a populist himself. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. That is, that you will not let the terms of the gold standard and what it required in terms of domestic economic management suffocate the farmers of this country. In terms of today's discussion, this I would say is was a left-wing variant of populism because it targeted in the first instance the moneyed interests, the banks, the financial institutions in Northeast, the corporations who were viewed rightly as the upholders of the gold standards, the beneficiaries of this fixed set of rules for economic management, and those were the enemies of the people, so to speak. So this is historically the first expression of opposition to globalization, to the gold standard. Now the populists never did not win. In part because of luck, that there were sort of gold discoveries in the 1960s, so credit terms eased up, money supply increased, interest rates went down, and sort of the urgency of the populist rebellion subsided. But about 30 or 40 years later, the ultimate collapse of the gold standard in Britain, 1931, when Britain decided to get off from its sort of very short-term resumption back to the gold standard, was driven very much by the similar kind of grievances, that the terms of the gold standard imposed hardships on the domestic economy in terms of high inflation, high real interest rates, and you needed to loosen those reins. And of course, ultimately, FDR, 2 years later in 1933, would take the United States out of the gold standard for the same reason. Now, when I think about this relationship between economics and politics, I find it helpful to think in terms of this, what I've called the political trilemma of the world economy. And what the trilemma says is that taking these three things together, hyperglobalization, national sovereignty, and mass politics or democratic politics, that you can have at most two of those three things, but never really all three. And one way to describe the relevance of this trilemma is precisely through sort of this history of the international economy and the variants of globalization that we have experienced. Because after all, the gold standard, or more broadly, the gold standard model of globalization was one that connected hyperglobalization with national sovereignty. You might say, well, what did the sovereign do if it was so constrained? What the sovereign did was actually to enforce the contracts. So the sovereign did a lot, was to actually enforce the rules of the gold standard. But what was not allowed, essentially, was responsiveness to domestic claimants when those claims went beyond what the rules of the global economy required. Tom Friedman has this nice analogy. He's talking about in this book, I think, Lexus and the Olive Tree, about sort of how hyperglobalization, in my terms, is really this wonderful thing for economics because it makes your economy expand. But what it does, he says, is it makes your politics narrow down. And the analogy is you're allowed to have only a choice between Coke and Pepsi, and no local flavors are allowed. That's because the range of what is it that you can do is limited by the constraints placed on you by international investors, by capital markets, and by trade rules. Now, the Bretton Woods model of globalization, which was erected after the Second World War, and whose chief architect really was John Maynard Keynes, was informed by the experience of the gold standard and was explicitly crafted to avoid the central problems, the central problem of the gold standard, and the way that Keynes view that in the 20th century, with much more participatory politics, with organized labor, trade unions, mass media, and the government having to be much more responsive to what local claimants and stakeholders asked for, it was impossible to leave your economic management on automatic pilot or to constrain it through international rules that maintained open markets. So the Bretton Woods model was especially crafted in Keynesian terms, for example, to leave room for domestic national macroeconomic management, to pursue, for sovereigns to be able to pursue macroeconomic management. How could you do that? You could do that only by restricting the free flow of capital. So that if you would free domestic economic management from the demand, from the short-term, day-to-day demands of financial market confidence. And Keynes was very explicit that you needed the capital controls in place in this new system, not as a temporary expedient. It wasn't until the financial markets would stabilize, and then you would bring back the free mobility of capital. In fact, he said this was a permanent arrangement. It had to be a permanent arrangement because you had to leave space for national economic management. Now, in the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944, this was largely about the international monetary and financial system. But a parallel system developed in the trade, in terms of trade rules, under the auspices of the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade. And I would argue that very much the same principle or the philosophy underlay the development of trade rules, which was that you should leave the maximum amount of space for domestic policies as possible. And therefore, the agenda for trade liberalization under the GATT was remarkably unambitious. It was limited to quantitative restrictions and import tariffs at the border, on manufacturing, and essentially just for advanced countries. Developing countries could do whatever they wanted. There were essentially no constraints in terms of agriculture or tradable services. And even when manufacturing in the early 1970s came under pressure, that looked like some domestic social bargains might be upset by the expansion of garment exporters from the developing countries in the late 60s and early 70s, immediately the system readjusted itself by imposing the so-called multi-fiber arrangement, which was to allow advanced countries to impose or to reimpose quantitative restrictions on imports, so to protect their domestic economies. So both in the international monetary system and in terms of trade rules, the Bretton Woods Compromise was one which essentially kept hyper-globalization at bay, that it was essentially opening up space for national economic management, and the priority for the national sovereign was to respond to domestic politics for the most part. Now, interestingly, and this is a very important point, the way that I've described to you the Bretton Woods regime, capital controls on the one hand, significant freedom for governments to do whatever they wanted on the trade policy on the other, you might think that this would have left you with essentially a kind of an autarkic world economy where globalization was dead on arrival. In fact, globalization took off in the decades after the Second World War. World trade and long-term investment grew by leaps and bounds, much faster than world GDP, and living standards were improved throughout substantial parts of the world economy, developed and developing countries alike. So this was truly a period of globalization, if you measure them by the expansion of world trade and investment. But I think it validated the view of Keynes and others, and I think it's a relevant lesson to this day, that in some ways the best kind of globalization is a globalization that rests on the ability of domestic economic management, or the ability to have the kinds of regulations and management that creates healthy economies and societies, and that the best kind of globalization might be built on that kind of foundations, rather than reversing the priorities, which is to sort of try to remake domestic economies and societies in light of the constraints that are imposed from the global economy. So I think what the wrong turn in the title is really what happens in the 1990s. And it's exemplified by two developments. One is the creation of the World Trade Organization. I'm not a critic of World Trade Organization on all dimensions, but I think the one aspect of it which is the most germane to my discussion is that the world trade rules through the WTO became much more expansive. They went from this very limited conception of what international disciplines should be to encompassing many new areas: services, agriculture, intellectual property rights, industrial policies, subsidies, health and sanitary conditions, that was just the beginning, because subsequently to the WTO, in fact, the kind of regional and bilateral trade agreements also multiplied in the 1990s. If you look at a chart of the number of regional trade agreements, they took off in the 1990s. And each one of them essentially tightened those disciplines much further. So for example, in intellectual property rights, practically every agreement that the United States signs tightens the rules on intellectual property rights relative to the previous one that it has. So the WTO essentially becomes just the floor. Similarly, the rules on investment, the bilateral investment treaties, and the approach, the ISDS approach in there was sort of carried into the trade agreements and became a feature of international trade agreements. And these ISDS, as you know, sort of created new privileges for foreign investors, often beyond and above what domestic investors had, and created a lot of problems problems. Of course, Julian and others on this panel have written extensively, very insightfully on this. So the first thing was the WTO model of deep integration. The second, of course, was the financial globalization. Until the 1990s, financial globalization, that is the presumption that countries should have open capital accounts, that capital should be free to move, was the exception rather than the norm. After the 1990s, that was reversed. That thanks to the OECD and the IMF and the US Treasury pushing, in part through the trade agreements that were being signed, or rules that the OECD set in terms of membership for potential members, that the expectation was in fact reversed, that the norm became that countries ought to have free flow of capital and free finance. I would say that both of these features of this new regime, deep integration and financial globalization, were essentially predicated on the idea that countries would ultimately converge to a single economic model. So I think this is clearest in the case of China. And I think it's still one of the biggest problems that the world economy faces today. It didn't make sense to create an international trade regime like the WTO or encourage financial globalization unless you believe that countries would converge to a kind of a rather similar model of how you run your economy. Otherwise, you'll be running into conflicts all the time, as indeed we are doing now. So I don't think the lawyers and the technocrats who designed this agreement at the time would tell you so much, but I think it was ultimately predicated on the notion that the only way you could accommodate a country like China in the system was if China became a market economy more or less like what the United States and Europe wanted it to be. And sometimes that argument was turned around by saying, by bringing China into the WTO, in fact, we would ensure that they were going to become more like us. But ultimately, I would say, with only, I think, mild exaggeration, that what this wrong turn, what I've called the wrong turn, or the post-1990 globalization, entails is a kind of reversion or inversion of ends and means. And that's what I mean also by return to the gold standard model, that globalization becomes an end rather than the means. So rather than, as in the preamble of the GATT, saying that the world economy exists so that governments can pursue those policies and can fulfill their objectives of full employment and economic prosperity, in fact, maintaining the rules of the global economy becomes an end, and everything else domestically has to adjust. And you can see this in the agendas. So go back again to the Coke and Pepsi. It wasn't that in this period the center left and the center right didn't have different agendas. The center right would say we need to cut taxes, we need to deregulate the economy. Why? So that we can become more competitive in the global economy. The left had their own narrative, which was we have to invest in education, and we have to invest in infrastructure. Why? So we become more competitive in the world economy. So it was all these adjustments were actually were called for the same reason. It was just how you achieve this was really what differed. But there was no big disagreement. In fact, I think one of the reasons why the left, I believe, has been so unable to capitalize, really until recently, on the grievances that have come to the political forefront in the last few years, is because the left, in the form of sort of the New Democrats here, New Labour in Britain, Schröder's SPD in Germany, essentially being complicit in this, sort of as acting as cheerleaders for this kind of globalization, with Tony Blair famously saying that at the time that, look, this you have no choice. This is globalization. You can't turn back on it. You just have to essentially grin and bear it. Now, Going back to the trilemma, of course, in principle, you can imagine a third way of, I shouldn't mix my metaphors, say square to circle, but just deal with the triangle. Is you could imagine that you could simply get rid of the nation state and have multilateral institutions that are democratic, accountable, that design rules for the world economy. You can simultaneously have hybrid globalization, but you simply give up national sovereignty. And what's so great about national sovereignty anyhow? And some of the technocrats during the 1990s and 2000s would ultimately see as sort of this is the direction in which it's going. And in particular, if you sort of apply this to the part of the world economy where I think its workings are the clearest, because the integration of markets has gone so far to the Eurozone. The creators, the architects of the European Union always had in the back of their minds the idea that ultimately you would be achieving a kind of a political union in Europe. But simply you had to go at it slowly. And from the perspective of the trilemma, the mistake that the Eurozone or European Union made was simply in starting from the 1980s, make a huge, big, and very rapid leap into economic integration, into the European version of hyper-globalization, the single market, while the institutional integration and the fiscal and political integration took a second step. And then when more recently the Eurozone crisis hit, rather than try to deepen European solidarity, which might have been sort of a way of trying to push harder on achieving political integration, to manage the crisis as a kind of a morality tale, as a conflict between the thrifty, hardworking, and hard-saving Germans versus the lazy, cheating Greeks. And that that was sort of was not entirely conducive to the building of the kind of solidarity within Europe that you need to proceed on this. And I think ultimately the beneficiaries have been the populists. Now, I want to just make one point clear before I go on to sort of where this would take me in terms of how to think about globalization today, is I want to be clear about sort of where the tension between democracy and globalization arises, in my view. That it doesn't arise from, moving in the wrong direction. It does not arise simply, or it doesn't arise mainly, or even in part, from the notion that if you're going to have free flow of goods, capital, services, that you need common set of rules, that you can't let national borders impose transactions costs, and therefore these common rules necessarily imply some restrictions on what national sovereigns can do. That is not, I think, where the tension arises, because we know that there are a lot of different domains where democratically elected governments can delegate authority to autonomous agencies, or in the case of international relations, international agreement, to international organizations, or to treaties. But they do so in a way that doesn't necessarily undermine democracy. In fact, that delegation is a way in which you can improve the functioning of democracy. So that's the principle in political science of democratic delegation. And as some political scientists have argued, you can view, in fact, some forms of globalization or some of these global rules as precisely doing that function. That is, acting in ways that limit the power of special interests or enhancing the quality of democratic liberalization, so that in its best day, the WTO or the IMF, what they're doing is really not constraining domestic democratic functioning, but they're actually improving its functioning. So here, the argument is no different than why, in a domestic setting, you may want to delegate monetary authority or monetary policy to an independent central bank because you worry that, if you were running monetary policy through your Congress, that, the day-to-day conduct of monetary policy by your representatives, would not be the most sensible thing to do, and therefore you delegate a bunch of technocrats within some, with a clear-cut mandate to do that for you. And you can see essentially in some ways what the WTO does, or the rules with respect to free capital mobility doing the same. But the problem, of course, is that just because in principle such constraints can improve the function of democracy doesn't mean that they necessarily do, and therefore we still have to pass the existing constraints from the filter of do they actually improve the functioning of democracy. And I think the simplest, if crudest, but I think still carries a lot of power, test is to ask the question of whether the global rules that exist that sustain a particular model of globalization, whether they are actually designed to address genuine problems of democratic malfunction. The archetypal version of this is a time consistency problem, or whether they are designed to simply reinforce, strengthen, and render permanent the bargaining leverage that certain distributive factions have, so financial interests, multinationals, skilled professionals, over the rest of society, and essentially to run around the existing domestic social bargains through the international economy. And I think I would argue that a lot of what happened after the 1990s was in fact of the second kind rather than the first kind, that they were of the nature of first order redistributive and of the nature of refashioning domestic social contracts under the guise of expanding the overall economic frontier and possibilities of increase in living standards. So I think that's the sense in which I would say that much of what happened after the 1990s through the mechanisms I briefly described were in tension with democracy. So going back to populism, looking at it from the perspective of this trilemma, one way of understanding populist success is to say, as I've heard one former Eurozone minister say in private, so I won't name him, but he says, the populists are winning in Europe today because they are the only ones who are telling the truth about the trilemma. That the central mainstream political elites still argue that you can have your cake and eat it too, that you don't have to make a decision in Europe, for example, between sort of giving up national sovereignty or deepening the single market. Of course, nobody talks about giving up on democracy. So populists are very clear and upfront about their preference for national sovereignty. And if that means let's do away with elements of the single market or hyperglobalization, why not? They're completely okay with that. Now, this preference, in a lot of cases, is matched typically with a kind of very nativist, exclusionary domestic agenda. But the point, of course, and that's part of the reason why I mentioned the US populist movement at the outset, that doesn't have to be the only kind of populist response. There's also a left-wing variant, and I think perhaps that left-wing variant is becoming a little bit more evident in recent months, as I think we see in the United States now with sort of so many candidates from the left wing of the Democratic Party. I would say that the New Deal was an example of that left-wing variant because the New Deal basically had very little support from economists or technocrats at the time. In fact, even Keynes, who liked what FDR was doing in terms of sort of, what today we call Keynesian policy of increasing spending, thought that he was doing too many other things at the same time, like the mucking around with sort of the rules of, labor markets and improving social insurance, that this would simply muddy the waters. I want to go through the rest of my slides very quickly because I've already been speaking for too long. when I say that we took a wrong turn, I don't want you to leave sort of thinking that we have to go back to the Bretton Woods, because that's not possible. So I think, so the question is, what might a globalization today that actually sort of goes back to the spirit of the Bretton Woods era, if not exactly to the sort of same principles, same practices, what would that look like? So I would suggest that two key criteria. One is that we want to have rules that are not first-order redistributive, as we've had so much. They tend to produce benefits for a lot of people rather than too few. What that essentially means, since most things you do in globalization are going to impose some benefits here and some costs there, it means essentially focusing on areas where the efficiency gains are large rather than small. Because when the efficiency gains are large, you have the possibilities of redistribution and compensation. So we can talk about that if you're interested, but a lot of the reason why compensation did not happen after the 1990s, I would argue, was that in fact compensation was economically infeasible because the net gains were so small. And this is an important point also. Will have some implications for areas where I think we can move on globalization. The second criterion would be just to privilege the principle of institutional diversity across nations. You can justify this on a number of different bases. I'll justify it in economic terms in the following ways, which is to say that the national regulatory arrangements, national institutional arrangements that support markets are not unique. Different societies have different preferences arising from their levels of development, their historical trajectory, culture, whatever you want to think. And therefore, the public goods, which are these institutional arrangements, have to be responsive, have to be shaped in response to these preferences. And these will globally differ across nations. Okay? And because of that, I think global arrangements, therefore, cannot move us all the way to complete elimination of transactions costs, which would, through institutional arbitrage, would undermine this diversity, that we always have to seek a middle point, that we get the benefits of trade, the benefits in large markets, without giving up also the benefits of institutional diversity. So that means you cannot go to either corner of autarky or complete hyperglobalization. So what would that might mean in specific areas? I think in international trade, that means essentially going back to, I'd like to draw the analogy with the international relations, the sort of the peaceful coexistence in the sphere of security between the United States and the Soviet Union, that once the United States accepted that communist regime would be there for a while, and the Soviet Union accepted that the United States was not going to have a communist revolution, it wasn't about getting rid of each other's systems, it was about ensuring that you wouldn't get into a nuclear war. I think the economic equivalent of that today is for the United States to understand that the Chinese economic system is there for a reason. It's not going to go away. It's not going to converge to the US model. So the international rules have to provide for traffic rules rather than presume that these differences can be negotiated away by forcing China into a kind of a particular mold, expecting that China is not going to have industrial policies, and so on. It would also imply sort of a kind of much reduced role for ISDS for obvious reasons. It would also mean revising the existing escape clauses in the international trade regime. I think the escape clause by default in the existing international trade regime is anti-dumping. Anti-dumping is a terrible, terrible, terrible way of engaging in sort of getting, if you think about it as a safety valve, which is that when domestic political pressure builds up, you want governments to be able to temporarily protect. Anti-dumping is one of the worst ways you can do it. So I'd much rather have a much better a safeguards regime, including what I would call a kind of an anti-social dumping scheme, which I'm happy to go into if there are questions. In international finance, I would sort of reverse the presumption that capital mobility is the norm. I think the norm should be that capital mobility is subject to domestic management. Interestingly, the IMF has already moved some ways into this, so there's already sort of some movement. In the area of global tax havens, I think I'm here a clear need for much more exchange of information, and something like a global financial registry would be part of that. Now, labor mobility. So I've said this was the part which the gold standard had, and which has disappeared from globalization. It's not that labor isn't moving; it's moving, but it's always sort of, the system is extremely patchwork, and barriers are still very high. Now, this may seem a little bit contradictory, but if there is one area in the world economy where you have still significant net gains, this is in the area of labor mobility, the trade and labor services. That's because in economics there's a principle that the efficiency cost of a barrier increases with the square of the size of the barrier, or rather for a tax. Think about a government-imposed tax. That is a tax that is 4 times as large, as 16 times as damaging to economic performance. So when you apply that principle to labor, the labor barriers are of the order of, let's say, 800% if you try to ask the question, what is the tax equivalent of a barrier that prevents a Honduran or Guatemalan worker to come into the United States? That's 800% compared to the barriers in trade, which are of the order of 2-3%. Okay? So I don't know if you square 800% relative to 2%, and you'll see the difference. So, and the point here is that precisely because the gains are so large, here you actually have some ability to design mechanisms that you can compensate the losers. So let's not be, let's not forget, there will be losers if you expand programs like temporary worker visa programs. But unlike in trade, unlike in financial mobility, where the gains are very small because the barriers are have already been whittled down, here you can actually design schemes, and I'm happy to talk again if you have questions, that basically redistribute the gains in a way where essentially most parties can win. And so I'll stop with just a couple of words on government and governance. I think it's again sort of it's implicit in what I've said that I like a weaker model of global governance because I think most areas don't actually need it. I like the WTO's dispute settlement mechanism, but I would apply it to a much narrower range of areas, the ones that I think create true beggar thy neighbor problems and global commons. I don't think subsidies or industrial policies actually belong. Again, I'm happy to defend that. Climate change, let's focus, global governance where there are true problems of global commons, like health pandemics or climate change. Those are true global commons problems. The world economy is not a global commons. If you pursue bad policies, including protectionist policies, you are the country that is hurt the most. Okay? So it's not by changing international rules that you're going to really prevent countries from acting against their domestic true national interest. It's only by changing, in fact, the way that domestic democracies work. Okay, let me just, and here again, I think the main lesson from the GATT Bretton Woods period was actually that a thinner model of globalization can actually be, produce a lot of globalization, and I think would be also more sustainable because it would be more in line, more consistent with the way that our politics are set up, being distributed across nation states today rather than anything else. So I'll just stop here. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you so much for that wonderful and illuminating talk. Without further ado, I want to turn us to our roundtable for sort of series of brief interventions by each of the roundtable participants. I will be very brief, but each of the other participants should take the amount of time we discussed before. You don't lose time. So I'm going to just start and then go to Professor Efron, Robin Efron, because I think our comments will be on sort of similar themes of dispute resolution. And then maybe we'll go the opposite order from Sanjay, Thomas, Ben, and Steve. So my question to you, Dani, is just about institutions generally. So obviously a large part of the critique is a critique of global governance and global governance institutions that emerged since the 90s. And what I want to push you, it sort of starts from what you said at the very end, which is there's some kinds of institutions are different from others, and we're all lawyers here, and so the one that we're most fascinated with is courts, right? Dispute resolution in the courts. And reading your work, especially in the globalization paradox, it often feels like judicialization is hyper-globalization par excellence. Now, I know from what you just said, you don't fully believe that in the WTO context, but it would be really interesting to me to get a better sense of why. Why courts can play a positive role, and in what ways they can play a positive role in a sort of reform of globalization. So in one sense, as all lawyers know after their first year of law school anyway, courts fit sort of strangely within the trilemma. On the one hand, they seem to be integrated, right? They're highly integrated. Courts always make law, no matter what they say they're doing. They're creating law, they're stitching things together. They're doing so not really responsively to the demos. So they're integrated, but they're counter-majoritarian. Not necessarily anti-democratic, but counter-majoritarian. And international courts, at least, are necessarily anti-sovereign in some sense, right? They're always painted as anti-sovereign, at least in an immediate sense. Courts sovereigns submit to their jurisdiction, they lose cases, and they're bound sometimes, right? So the question then, though, is how this fits within your scheme. And as you said at the very beginning, the devil is always in the details. Different courts have different structures, different kinds of doctrines, different spirits, different approaches. And so one sort of interesting thing about the WTO dispute settlement body, the appellate body, is that in that context, it has been the court, arguably, and Rob House has famously argued this, that has actually driven the move of the WTO system away from hyperglobalization and back towards a sort of more Bretton Woods era style of globalization, specifically with the disciplines for everyone who's taken trade in the room on SPS and on TBT and TRIPS. The WTO appellate body has found ways to reduce the innovative parts of the deep integration treaties and bring it back towards the level of the GATT. At the same time, though, this is a double-edged sword, the WTO has also read the GATT disciplines, especially non-discrimination, in extremely, extremely robust ways. So on the one hand, they reduce hyperglobalization. On the other hand, they sort of hyperglobalize some of the older GATT-style norms. I think this question really is important when we turn to the question of reform, because two of the biggest questions of the day across international economic law is what to do about our trade regime, what to do about our investment regime. And it's kind of going in the opposite directions, but it's the same question. So in trade, the big question is, do we save the WTO, and how do we save the WTO appellate body, which the Trump administration is strangling and will probably be dead within a few months, or at least, in the icebox. Hopefully not dead. And then in the investment context, the question is whether or not to stitch together this mode of ISDS, investor-state dispute settlement, ad hoc arbitration, into a multilateral investment court. And depending on who you ask, that's getting more or less traction. But certainly major economies, the European Union, is pushing this idea of a single multilateral investment court as a way to actually resolve problems that you would call hyperglobalization problems in ISDS. It's an interesting idea, right? Because you're integrating further, you're moving away from a system of ad hoc arbitration. So in a sense, you're hyperglobalizing. You're reducing sovereignty in some ways while enhancing it in others, because you're creating a court that can create jurisprudence, that can create law. So that reduces sovereignty. But at the same time, this is a situation where countries can choose the judges and elect judges. They have some kinds of democratic controls. So it's just a kind of a question of how it fits in. Maybe the answer is that it's a short-termism versus a long-termism thing, that certain kinds of institutions like courts or, as you said earlier, agencies, you give up some jurisdictions to get more robust gains. or more robust control in the end. So maybe that's the answer, but I wonder if courts require a different flavor of analysis under your trilemma scheme than you apply to the other types of international institutions.
So I will also be brief in favor of our more distinguished guests here. But to pick up where Julian left off and maybe distinguish two types of institutions here. So I think all of the concerns about courts, especially formal international institutions that are largely dealing with disputes between states or between states and private parties are important for all of those reasons. I want to talk about arbitration in a slightly different context, which is largely private party arbitration. And I think that arbitration is both a confirmation of the trilemma, but also poses a little bit of a challenge to it in that it almost hijacks the trilemma. So let me try to explain what I mean here. So courts, right, as we already heard, there's already a little bit of a problem with courts, even in a domestic system, being somewhat undemocratic, right, especially courts where judges are appointed and not elected. But arbitration takes things even one step further away from democracy, because now not only are the decision makers not elected, but they're not even appointed to institutions that have been designed by elected officials or have been appointed by elected officials, right? So we've taken one step further back. And then in the international context, right, it's unclear what sort of sovereign they're beholden to. Right? So this is where I want to posit the idea that arbitration kind of hijacks the trilemma, right? So in one sense, it is very much like the trilemma, right? It's hard to think of having lots of things at once. And one thing that I would add here is that the thing that is most missing in arbitration that you even have in some of the contexts that we've heard about with international dispute resolution tribunals is transparency, right? So arbitration is famously opaque, right? And this is true even in the domestic context and the consumer context, but it is hard to know what's going on, right? A lot of the law going in is opaque, the decision-making process is opaque, the negotiations and machinations of the parties are unseen by other people, and the outcomes are often very hidden. And I think that that is something that is challenging to democracy, right, in a way that is yet different from courts and from other institutions. But the thing that I find interesting about arbitration is that it kind of mimics what we think we want, but takes something away. So here's the hijacking part. In order for arbitration to really work, it relies on domestic enforcement, because at the end of the day, none of these awards are going to mean very much unless you can go to a court in any particular country and get that award enforced. And of course, that is why we have all of these other international institutions and conventions that are set up to help us understand what arbitral awards are and when they should be enforceable. Right? So what that's doing is it is hijacking the sovereignty element, right? In that it's saying, look, here we have something that is hyper-sovereign in a way, right? This whole thing is based on territorial, jurisdictional enforcement of awards. But in reality, it is quite removed from many of these things, right? Because even though we have these international conventions on how arbitration is supposed to work and awards are enforced, the reality is that most states, and this goes exactly with the timeline that we've seen starting in the 90s, give more and more space and deference to arbitration, both in terms of what goes into arbitration and what comes out of arbitration, in a way that seems to not be terribly respectful of sovereignty at all, right? The whole thing is sovereignty in service of what is not just sort of a global regime, but a very private regime, right? And I just want to end this by saying that not only, right, does it kind of hijack the sovereignty part, but it also hijacks in a little bit the democratic part. Because you might say, oh, arbitration is great, right? It's this stateless institution or an institution that is very removed from the state. But particularly in the international context, the vast majority of the parties that are participating in arbitration are large businesses, right? In the domestic context, we have all sorts of different problems with arbitration that have to do with the power of, say, consumers vis-a-vis large corporations. Right? But here we have this, supposedly global system that is a little bit divorced or removed from the state, but it doesn't really have the input at all of, the average Joes, right? The laborers, the citizens, the environmentalists, anyone else, right? Instead, it is the interests of business who are interested in investment and capital, and it's sort of the movement of goods across borders, right? So I would say that arbitration is a system that both kind of like mimics and reinforces the trilemma, but also hijacks it in some interesting ways that are worth thinking about.
Thank you very much, first of all, to Julian and also to Brooklyn Law School for this opportunity. It's really a great privilege and, as always, extremely intellectually stimulating to be able to hear Dani Rodrik speak. And in particular, I think in this talk, he's brought together many strands of his work over 25 years at least, if not longer, relating to different aspects of globalization in a very unifying and I think very convincing way. But I would like to press him a little bit, much as I'm in sympathy, even deep sympathy with what he's saying, about how to frame his arguments. And it may just be a question of framing. It might be a question of conceptualization, or it may simply be a question of framing, and perhaps he can speak to that. And in particular, I'm interested in the question of whether what we really ought to be thinking and talking about is an alternative form of globalization, or whether we should be thinking and talking about having a moderated globalization. It seems very often in his presentation of these ideas that he's referring to a moderated globalization. But one might be thinking about a globalization that is simply qualitatively structured in a different fashion. Now, of course, one might shade into the other insofar as moreness and lessness can involve the dimensions as well as the extents within each dimension. So, for example, is capital mobility part of what we are referring to when we refer to globalization or not? That's a question of whether it is included as a dimension. But once we are thinking or speaking about capital mobility, we might, of course, consider further questions as to the conditions under which capital mobility will be permitted. And that might not simply be a question of extent. It may be a question of the qualitative understanding of the nature of the principles or the rules that are present in relation to capital mobility. I'm going to give momentarily an example from trade based upon my own work on this issue, but let me try to frame that within a larger kind of a conceptual understanding. I think that one way of thinking about society, and what we do in society, is that we give up certain freedoms in order to have freedoms. Sometimes we give up freedoms in one dimension in order to have freedoms in another dimension. Sometimes, arguably, we give up freedoms in a given dimension in order to have more freedoms in that same dimension. That might seem a little bit paradoxical, but I think one can think of various examples of that kind. Very often they relate to the commons, but they don't always relate to the commons. I mean, for example, if I want to play soccer with my friends, it would be helpful to be able to reserve the soccer field so that other groups that also want to play soccer with one another are not claiming the soccer field at the very same time that I am. And the fact that there's a schedule and that I have to sign up with my friends to play soccer at a particular time is not a deep infringement of my freedoms. Indeed, it's an enabling condition for me to be able to exercise those freedoms in a way that's meaningful, relevant, and useful to me. Can we think about globalization in much the same way? And now I'll offer the example from trade. And it's only an example, I think, because one can think of parallel examples with respect to many other issues. Tax coordination, which I think Dani mentioned in the slides he circulated, and many other such instances. Now, as our economist colleagues Kyle Bagwell and Robert Steger have pointed out, for example, the WTO system could be viewed as fundamentally asymmetrical and indeed incomplete, in the sense that it includes a ceiling. It centers, in fact, on the idea of ceilings on tariffs, but it does not include floors on social and environmental standards. And as a consequence, it leaves open the possibility of trying to gain market advantage by lowering social and environmental standards. This, they argue, is a reason that from the standpoint of the motivating logic of the WTO itself, there ought to be floors as well as ceilings. Now, if one takes their argument on its face, and it's not primarily motivated out from an intrinsic concern with labor standards, but from a purely instrumental point of view, then introducing this restriction or this limitation that one may not lower floors beneath a certain level is actually a way of furthering the stated objective to a larger extent. But if one is also interested, namely mutual market access, but if one is also interested in labor standards in and of themselves and in the ability of countries to enhance labor standards domestically, then one might be concerned with bringing about a set of international rules that limit the ability of countries to compete in this way so as to give them the required kind of policy autonomy, namely to ensure that their labor and environmental standards are of a sufficient level. Now, of course, they could have that policy autonomy by delinking and not engaging in international trade, but to the extent that it is also an objective for them to engage in international trade and not to be undercut by similarly positioned countries, it becomes a way of pursuing their own greater effective freedom to, in fact, enter into an agreement with other countries to limit their abilities to compete in this particular way, which ends up being destructive and self-undermining. Now, of course, as Dani noted, it is very crucial to identify and to distinguish those cases which in some sense have this quality of enhancing the effective sovereignty of countries in the directions that they wish to exercise that sovereignty, and those kinds of agreements which may end up not doing so, for example, simply by empowering domestic constituencies that have very contrary objectives. But that is not an argument against pursuing, and I don't think he thinks it is, but it's not an argument against pursuing such international cooperation as such. So my question to Dani, and here I will end, is really whether what we ought to be thinking about is the pursuit of an alternative form of globalization which is framed as enhancing the effective sovereignty of countries, in which case the trilemma might be seen less in terms of the maintenance or the giving up of national sovereignty and more in terms of the achievement of an effectively enhanced national sovereignty through international cooperation.
Great. Thanks a lot to Julian and to Professor Rodrik for the invitation and this amazing talk, and thanks a lot to all of you for listening to us on this evening in Brooklyn. It's really a great pleasure to comment on Professor Rodrik's speech and to connect it to my own work and work that we've been doing at NYU in a project on the global regulation of globalization. And I would like to make 2 points, one about the trilemma framing and one about a particular kind of globalization that my work is focused on, which is digital globalization and how trade law might need to react to that. So let me start with the first point. And I want, on the trilemma, and I want to be very clear that I find the trilemma incredibly generative and helpful in thinking about the problems we are facing in the global economy. Having said that, I also think it's not correct in capturing the problems we are facing. So it's helpful, but incorrect. And the reason why I think it's incorrect stems from its generality in part. As far as I understand, going back to your earlier writings, you developed it out of a trilemma that dealt with the optimal regulation of capital that tried where the trilemma is between reconciling fixed exchange rates, mobility of capital, and monetary autonomy. And in that context, I can see why those things might be binaries in it themselves. You either have fixed exchange rates or not. You either have monetary autonomy or you don't. And I can also see how the question might be, how do I need to maximize each of those to achieve an optimal degree of economic development, however measured? It's much less clear to me how to answer those questions for the trilemma of, that you talked about today, where we're talking about hyperglobalization, mass politics, democracy, and sovereignty in the nation state, because each of those is really much more complex in itself. And I would allege that one can and should try to reconcile the three. And I see the EU as an attempt of doing precisely that. Now, you mentioned the EU as an example that shows why it fails, why the kind of proving the trilemma, but it's not clear to me what exactly it's proving. So what's the metric of success here, or what's the normative goal that we are measuring the EU or other attempts of reconciling the three dimensions against? And I sense that it's a mix of a certain sense that there's a lack of stability. Maybe the economist is missing some equilibrium that creates stability in the trilemma, so that the failure is instability, and that might create uncertainties, might be unhelpful in terms of raising transaction costs. Or it might be a suboptimal economic outcome measured in GDP. And it's not clear, really not clear to me which of the two it is. And to the extent it's the latter, I think there's a real problem, as you've pointed out in your own work, in our inability to measure, actually, the success of the global economy. And even if you have an increase in trade, that might not translate into an increase in GDP. And even if we have an increase in GDP, the distribution of the GDP gains might be so unequal that we are actually normatively not in agreement with it. And that leads me to my second part about digital globalization, because I think the numbers we have about digital globalization are the most inaccurate ones. Ordinary services that each and every one of us consumes on a daily basis for free are not captured by our ordinary economic statistics, like a search on Google, because there's no price on that search. Instead, we measure the gains that Google creates on the advertising market. But is that really capturing what the increased welfare that a company like Google might create? So I'm raising that because there's a different story about globalization that one could tell, and that some of your colleagues tell. So Richard Baldwin argues that the best way to think about globalization is in terms of knowledge transfer. So he talks a lot about global value chains, firms that use information communications technology to operate globally. And if you emphasize that account, there's a real question what role international trade law played in that kind of development. So if one reads his book, international trade law hardly features at all. So the question, I guess, is then whether you are overestimating the significance of the entrenchment that came with the WTO's deep regulation agenda and underestimating the significance of technological developments that have advanced digital globalization. And that's, of course, a matter of degree. And I want to end with a more concrete question that I've been puzzling about in the context of digital globalization and how trade law has responded to it. That teases out another kind of sub-feature that came out quite clearly in your talk. So you acknowledge that there are instances in which international regimes can be empowering to nation states. But it seems to me that the way you frame it is there's an international regime and it empowers each and every single nation state on its own. But there might be instances in which you really need some kind of global institution or international regime between states to counter precisely the special interests that you and I are concerned about. So in the context of digitalization, one hot button issue is data localization. Should we be against or in favor of data localization from a legal international trade law perspective or from an economic perspective? And it's not clear-cut to me, but my intuition is that there's actually a case for data localization, both from a legal and economic perspective. The legal case is that data localization establishes jurisdiction. Once data is localized, the state can exercise jurisdiction over it, whereas especially middle or smaller powers might not be able to do so extraterritorially. And it's a different story for the EU or the US. And economically, there seems to be growing evidence that the value generation in a digital economy really hinges on your ability to access data. So again, in that light, data localization could be one way to ensure that data is made available to the local economy, either through mandatory data sharing requirements or through some other means that might actually be facilitated through an international organization.
Thank you very much, and thanks to Robin and Julian and to Brooklyn Law School. A lot of the thoughts that I had have already been picked up, especially on this side, so I'll be rather brief. But as I was thinking about how to react to this, my thinking was to put it provocatively and to pick up on some of the things Thomas has said, but to frame it in a different way. Has the trilemma at this point outlived its usefulness? Or to say it more in a more friendly way is, when speaking to a friendly audience who is critical of hyperglobalization, is the trilemma a useful guide to reform? Does it give us a menu of reform options? And that's where I'm skeptical. So I agree that the trilemma has enormous critical power. And unlike Thomas, as an American, I'm more ready to sort of unreflectively accept the idea that the EU is a basket case. And so I rather like the critical side of it. And one of the ways it has this critical power, which is more subtle, is that by separating democracy from sovereignty, and I'm sort of disappointed by the move to mass politics, which I think in this slide has been a move to sort of capture right-wing populism in the trilemma, maybe, which is not necessarily democratic, but I like the democracy because it forces you to sort of state which side you're on when in this sort of global versus local debate. Are you really about democracy, or are you really about national self-determination? And those are two different things. And the sort of less subtle and sort of more headline point of the critique is the critique of hyperglobalization. But of course, hyperglobalization is, as Sanjay has sort of pointed out, is a very specific idea about a specific depth of economic integration, and also a specific type in terms of what we capture as economic versus other types of things, right? So it's excluding generally labor and social policy and affirmative environmental regulation, et cetera. And once we agree that some sort of Washington consensus model of hyperglobalization isn't good and we don't want it, does the trilemma help us identify reform options or obscure them? And I think it obscures them because I'm less comfortable with the idea that you can easily present the many other forms of globalization as providing a strict trade-off with either national sovereignty or democracy. And I think that a lot of Professor Rodrik's work already anticipates many of these criticisms, so I don't have to go over them in depth. If you've read the work, you know that that he recognizes that as a matter of fact, thinner global rules don't lead to equal sovereignty around the world. Unequal market power, unequal military power, depending on what world you go back to or go forward to, are going to carry a lot of weight. The United States and Europe and China are going to be able to throw their weight around in a way that Lesotho is not going to be able to, and set standards extraterritorially. And that's very important. So Professor Rodrik, I think the response in the globalization paradox is that there's sort of a substantive and normative difference between being able to throw one's weight around or being able and versus being able to sort of project rules onto another country, right? And I think that's normatively contestable, and I'm not so sure that a mid-sized state that's subject to U.S. economic sanctions or would be subject to sort of the U.S. dictating capital controls would really agree with that. And so, so that's my first point on sovereignty. On democracy, democracy at the international level is also not necessarily inconsistent with democracy at the local level. And we talked about democratic delegations, which is one way, but there's also sort of democratic mechanisms that are not delegations. And you know, and so you may think of global governance mechanisms as actually trying to be a mutually enhancing, you know, polyarchic sites of multiple, you know, mutually recognizing deliberative fora. And so the work by Joshua Cohen and Chuck Sable on this, on directly deliberative polyarchy, is something that the globalization paradox engages with. But I think there, the answer from the globalization paradox is that these networky, deliberative, you know, sort of loosey-goosey, experimentalist forms of governance are inchoate and emergent and aren't going to take the place of national institutions when push comes to shove in the face of hyperglobalization. And that's right, but they're not supposed to take the place. They're supposed to supplement and mutually enhance. And so, so I don't know if, you know, we shouldn't pursue those things as long as we're also not pursuing hyperglobalization. And so, given my sort of partiality to talking about democracy, you know, Sanjay mentioned that maybe, you know, in your work you should become a theorist of what is effective sovereignty, and how do we come up with a globalization that advances effective sovereignty. And maybe the other sort of way of thinking about reform is, what should global democracy look like? You know, what sites of contestation do we want? How do we link them up? I agree that most of the action should remain at the national level, but how does that sort of join up globally, and what rules do we create to enhance that and to check the power of both national and international and private and public sites of governance?
Sorry, I have pictures, because why not? All right, so everybody knows, well, not everybody. Professor Rodrik doesn't know what I'm obsessed with, but he's about to find out. So I've got some pictures and a quote. And I was so excited to hear what you're talking about and just what your focus is, because it's really something that I've been spending a lot of time thinking about, the way our global tax system works. So I've got a quiz for the audience. Who knows how much tax Amazon is going to pay federally? Not in New York. Forget the whole Queens thing. Who knows how much tax? Do you know the answer? Zero. So there's your global tax system in operation. You know, Amazon, we know, is struggling. We know they're really struggling, so that makes a lot of sense. But no, it's not. All right. So what I'm I don't know if anybody recognizes what this image is behind my slides. But I'll explain. So just imagine, you know, it's, 1845, and you want to send a letter from Philadelphia to Harlem. Oh, wait, not that one. That one, two ways. All right, so you want to send a letter a long way. How do you do that, right? That's pretty easy now. We all know how we do it now. We throw a stamp on that, and it's pretty easy. But then it was really hard. So this is a letter that went from Philadelphia to Harlem in 1845, and the reason it's got all this writing and all these crazy marks on them, it needed you needed to pay for each leg of the trip. You needed to work with somebody to get it from Philadelphia to New York, then to France. It's a mess. Right? It's a mess. So what did this all mean? You know, you paid 5 cents to get it to New York, 85 cents Dutch postage to get, you paid on receipt. I don't know how you did that. And it actually left a lot of letters unclaimed because you had to pay to get the letter, and nobody wanted to do that. Then 50 Dutch cents to the French and 35 Dutch. This is a mess, right? So this is a mess. So what do we get? So this is a quote from Osterhammel, The Transformation of the World, A Global History of the 19th Century. And he's describing, this is in the same era as the gold standard and all this great stuff. He described historically unparalleled norm setting in countless areas of technology, communication, and cross-border trade, weights and measures, international mail, the International Universal Postal Union. There was one in 1874 and one in 1879. Railroad gauges, train timetables, coinage. These were all simplified and standardized for large areas of the world. And the thing that I'm obsessed with, that all of you but Professor Rodrik know, is tax. Actually, I gave it away with the tax thing. All right, that's fair. But what happened was, in this same era, the League of Nations, who brought you World War II and other delights, gave us a system of global tax that resulted in Amazon paying $0 of tax when it earned a lot of money. But it's a system that's based on this standardization, and what it was designed to do was ensure that you pay tax in only one jurisdiction. So the system is described as classification and assignment. You first classify the income as royalties or interest or business income, and then you apply a series of arbitrary rules that are designed to locate it in one jurisdiction or another. And if you're Amazon or GE, back when they were the cool kids doing this, you can do this in a way that results in zero tax ever, if you're really good at it, as GE did for a long time. And unfortunately, we're still stuck with it. So we have these bilateral double tax treaties that are really, it's incredible to look back into the 1920s when they designed them. We're doing exactly the same thing today in an era when global capital, global transactions are not rounding error, they are the main event. So I think this is an area in which the pattern that Professor Rodrik has identified is easy to see and painful to watch. So I really appreciated your talk and your work, and thank you very much.
All right, so we are running deplorably low on time, and so what I suggest that we do is just, if there are questions in the audience, why don't we take one or two brief questions now, and then we'll give Dani Rodrik a couple of minutes to respond, maybe 10 minutes ideally to respond. So if there are any brief questions, now would be a good time, and we have a mic going around the room. But you might resolve this problem for us if you don't have any brief questions.
Maybe I can say a few words. Well, I mean, first, I really want to thank all the panelists, and there's no way I can do justice to all these comments. So I guess what I'll do is I'll just, briefly sketch what I would say, what I would have said if I had more time, and if I were right. And I'm not sure. I know that I don't have enough time, but I'm just going to maybe just grouping what Julian Robbins' points about judicialization and arbitration. So the question, I guess, which you forced me to think about is really where does judicialization and arbitration really fit in there? And as Robin said, I think arbitration has become such a big thing here that in some ways it's hijacking both democracy and sovereignty in interesting ways that I haven't fully thought about. I think it's interesting. I think arbitration. So when I think about why arbitration became so dominant after the 1990s, it seems to me that it's really the product of a particular. It's the product really of the spread of market fundamentalism, for lack of a better word. That in the 80s and 1990s, private investment, therefore, property rights and contract enforcement became sort of the byword for economic development, and then it seemed very natural, therefore, that developing countries in particular should do everything to enforce property rights. So foreign investors, after all, without foreign investment, you couldn't possibly grow, and that became a huge priority. And then we got, I think, into this mess where I think there's a bit of a withdrawal from, but we don't know, as you said, where we're going to go. If we're going to have arbitration, I would prefer a more judicialized version of it with a standing court and proper judicial review and proper case law and things like that. But I think what Julian, you said made me think about the question about so where should we actually have this judicialization? Where does it actually properly belong? So I said this very quickly in my remarks that I actually am a big fan of the dispute resolution system within the WTO. It's a huge. It's really the only international responsibility that the United States has taken, which has ever made the United States do something that reverse something. I think that's literally true. That it's actually the only international treaty that has actually made the United States change something domestically that it was doing. So it's incredibly powerful. And if you look at it from the world as a whole, that you have a system that actually even can enforce, in some cases, different action on the United States, it can't be that bad. And I agree with a lot of things that Rob House says about sort of the self-restraint that the appellate body has brought. But the prior question is where does dispute result? So it's about really the substance of the agreement and what should be subject to international dispute resolution. So again, I'm fairly radical there. I would say that yes, by all means, pretty much apply to dispute resolution to the GATT, with some exceptions. I don't like anti-dumping. I think there's lots of problems with that. But I think with GATT, I think it's fine. But most of the new things that WTO wrote, subsidies, trims, SPS, TBT, TRIPS, I think they actually don't belong for very good reasons in the WTO or in any kind of international set of obligations and agreements. So I would not apply judicialization there at all, because I don't think I think they fundamentally should remain national prerogatives. Sanjay, you brought up I think a very interesting way of sort of distinction that alternative globalization versus a moderated globalization. You're right that I'm sketching out a much more sort of a moderated globalization rather than an alternative globalization. And I'm not at all against an alternative globalization. And I think sometimes I think about what would globalization be if the rules were written by UNCTAD, ILO, and UNESCO, as opposed to the IMF and the World Bank and the WTO, right? That would also be a globalization, but with very different kind of globalization. That's another way of thinking about the difference. I guess I'm not. So on principle, I'm not against taking on that broader vision. But I'm in general a skeptic of international rules that could effectively, what was your term, that would effectively enhance effective sovereignty. I'm a skeptic that the international system can do that. I'm skeptical the international system can actually do anything to significantly improve labor standards, for example. That if it doesn't come from within, it's not going to be the external rules are not going to in general do it. With some exceptions. Again, there are sort of. So I think that's what's. So in the case of, for example, ISDS, to tie this with the ISDS discussion, one response to the ISDS mess is for people to say, the fundamental problem with it is the asymmetry of rights that are conferred. That capital gets all these rights, but labor doesn't get the right to sue governments. And you might say, well, let's even the playing field, and let's actually give labor the rights to sue if a country is not enforcing its own standards or its own obligations under the ILO conventions. But I would rather take those rights away from capital than create additional kinds of rights for labor, which I don't think are going to be particularly effective. So. But I'm not at all averse to thinking about in terms of this alternative globalization model that you've laid out. Again, let me try to link Thomas's and Ben's comments, and I'm going to, use Ben's comment against Thomas's criticism of the trilemma, because I think, you on the one hand, you're right that these concepts are slippery, and there is a sense in which, maybe they can be reconciled, and maybe the EU does that, but I want to emphasize that precisely why sort of Ben ruled the trilemma less useful because we understood it, and then, but I think the EU actually is a case which shows that we actually don't understand it, because I think, as I understand it, Ben's criticism was that if you think about hyperglobalization only in terms of an idealized economic model of absence of transactions costs, that really, detracts attention from the rich discussion we could have about alternative globalization, maybe along the lines that Sanjay was talking about. On the other hand, the model of hyperglobalization that's in the EU is precisely that model of hyperglobalization. It's the single market. That's what it is. And it's a single market of eliminating all transactions costs to goods, services, labor, people, and that's exactly what it is. So that is very relevant. I have a hard time, even to sympathetic people in Europe, to try to convince them that in fact the trilemma is relevant and applies to the case of the EU, which I do believe it does. So there were other sort of interesting things in Thomas's comments about digital globalization, which I have to pass, unfortunately. Let me just sort of end with the question about this, about taxation, which is obviously is right. I mean, I think Google's office I believe in Bermuda employs 3 people, and the profits that are lodged there are in the tens of billions. It's really an amazing, I think you've obviously talked about this a lot more than I have, but it seems to me that a relatively simple solution that doesn't require a whole lot of international coordination is for individual countries to apply simply a kind of apportionment rule that namely tax corporations on the share of their global profits that's sort of prorated according to their local sales, and I think that's it's something. The fact that that is not done shows us that the constraint is not lack of international cooperation, is that that the domestic politics is captured by certain interests. So again, let me thank everybody here, and I apologize for I'm sure having missed out a lot of important other. It's not that it didn't register; it's just that I think we need to be mindful of the time.
Well, it was our treat to have such a rich and fruitful discussion. So thank you again so much, and please join me in thanking both Dani and our entire panel for joining us.